Welcome to the Old Guy AI podcast, brought to you by MongoDB. And now, here's Scott Sanchez and Pete Johnson.
Hello there. I'm Pete Johnson. I'm here, as always, with my good friend, Scott Sanchez. And Scott, before we get into AI content, what was your first car?
Ooh, my first car was a 1967 Ford Mustang convertible that we bought as a complete clunker and turned into something fantastic until the first winter, and a rear-wheel drive sports car in the Northeast was not awesome, but in the summer that was a car. How about you?
Summer of 86, I got access to what I consider my first car. It was a 1980 Ford Pinto. And when I say 1980 Ford Pinto, what's the first thing that comes to your head?
Didn't they explode?
It did not explode, although that was the model that did, and that my parents had no qualms about me riding around in a car that could explode with any,
Seems fine.
rear collision. Says something about how Gen X was raised, but that's a totally different podcast.
Well, speaking of podcasts, I want to point out that we are ahead of, I don't know, I'm going to make up a number, 99.9% of all podcasters that have ever tried podcasting, simply because we have made it to our second episode.
I know,
So,
right?
Congratulations us for making it further than most people who ever start a podcast and getting to episode 2.
Congrats to you as well, my friend. So let's talk about some AI. So last episode, we talked a lot about some of the OpenAI announcements and some of the things in market with Anthropic. But since then, we've both had some hands-on with GPT-5. What do you think so far?
I'm more impressed than I was expecting to be, especially with the voice mode. I haven't really played around with it for code generation or that kind of stuff yet. Just normal interactions. A lot of life stuff going on in my world at the moment, but yeah, just talking to it as the smartest thought partner that I could possibly have, and having it in a very conversational, very intelligent way, communicating back to me about all kinds of topics. And a few months ago, I would have said the same thing about Gemini, just how impressed I was with its ability to communicate with me. And this, again, subjectively, just far exceeds my experience there. What are your thoughts? Have you done more than just talk to it?
So I played around over the weekend with it a little bit. I didn't run into, last week you hit me on Slack and said you ran into the thing where it would switch models on you that some people had problems with. I didn't have that problem. And it was, I think, if you wanted to find negative press about how rough the rollout was, there's certainly no shortage of articles that you could read on that. There's one on, there's one on ZDNet. There's another one on Wired, and about are we really that close to AGI if we can't even do a proper rollout? There's certainly those kinds of criticism. But I found it to be a step up from what I had before. I used it for kind of fluff stuff. 30 years ago, I married into a family that has a sizable set of folks that live in Louisiana, and by extension, I'm required to be a New Orleans Saints fan, as I have been for about the last 35 years. So with the upcoming NFL season, I asked it, how bad are the Saints going to be? Because they're projected to be pretty bad. And it gave me good answers. And I said, well, how likely do you think the Saints are to get the number 1 pick? And then I asked it, I tried to get a little bit more sophisticated. What would it mean if the Saints got Arch Manning relative to other teams? And if you don't follow the NFL, you might not know Arch Manning is the grandson of Archie Manning, who was the number 2 pick by the Saints in the 1971 draft. He's seen as the first good player the Saints ever had. His grandson and namesake, like his 3 more famous sons, were born and raised in New Orleans, and it would mean a lot to the community if they could get him. But then what GPT-5 did that I didn't. It then said, would you like me to do a financial analysis of what it would mean for ticket sales, and what it would mean for merch, and what it would mean for the overall value of the franchise? And then it asked me, would you like to see that in a graph? So it not only processed things correctly, it gave me thoughtful follow-ups and a way to get me to consume more of the service, and then went multimodal on me. So I was really impressed with that.
Yeah, I've had similar interactions with the GPT-5 engine, I'll say, because it's not always GPT-5 as a model that you're interacting with, but as a as an interface, I've found very similar, where it's like, oh, would you like me to generate an image to represent, what we're discussing here? It's like, oh, sure, yeah, great. It gives me links, it gives me cost estimates for things, and it's just, to your point, it feels a lot more comprehensive than just predictive text generation, of a few models ago.
Now we're recording here on Wednesday, August 20th, and earlier in the week, Oracle announced that they've started to embed GPT-5 in some of their products across some of the OCI products and some of the SaaS applications as well. That was the first time I'd seen that.
It's so easy now to switch models, right? Like a couple of years ago, every new model came with a completely new API and interface, and it would take folks a while to get that sort of middleware layer updated to support what it's doing. I feel like the interface itself hasn't materially changed. The experience has. And so to the conversation we were just having, there's a lot more depth and breadth to it, but the way you interface with it, whether it's through the API of, prompt response, or,
Sure.
through the app, or whatever. So it doesn't feel like, I don't know, not to crap on our friends at Oracle, but it doesn't feel that novel to say, oh, we're implementing GPT-5 now. It's like, well, sure, because I changed the 4 to a 5 in my code, and now we're using it, right? What will be interesting to me is to see how and what they're able to deliver, or anyone's able to deliver, over and above the experience they were getting with the previous models. Like what actually changes, other than being able to say from a marketing perspective, we're using GPT-5. That's what I hope to see over the next coming weeks.
Sure. And whether you're rolling your own or you're using something like LangChain or Crew AI, or one of the growing list of frameworks that makes it pretty trivial, to your point, to change that model, not just among model families from GPT-4 to 5, but across vendors, makes that pretty seamless these days as well. It'll be interesting to see if that stays over the next 24 months, or whether there'll be some novel change to the API that everyone then has to react to in some way. And that segues a little bit into, we didn't spend much time last time talking about Google, and they've had an interesting timeline here the last 2 months. When you and I first sort of started talking in earnest about 2 months ago, we kind of had dueling deep research between Claude and Gemini. And at the time, one of the things I really liked about the way that Gemini was doing deep research, it's a little thing, but it made a big impact, was the way that it was doing bibliographies. And some of those papers, some of those market research papers that you were generating with it were pretty stellar, and made it easy to go follow the sources and check on them. Have you tried GPT with any of the deep learning and tried something similar yet, or have you not had that opportunity quite yet?
I experimented a little bit last week with GPT-5 and deep research, and I don't know that I think it just kicked me back to 4.0. Like, it didn't feel fundamentally different from what I would have experienced a month ago. And it could have been a BCC problem here, between chair and computer, of me just not using it correctly. But I don't know how much has changed there. I should probably put that on my to-do list to fiddle with, because if its level of intelligence for deep research has progressed the way its conversational capabilities have, I feel like we're in for a treat. I just don't know that I've experienced it yet. Have you kicked the tires on the new deep research stuff yet?
I haven't with GPT-5, but I have been sort of, if I have the need to write something, whether it's a blog article or something more deep research, I'll feed the same prompt to Claude and Gemini and see what I get out of both. We were just talking in the prep. I took the transcript of episode 1 and fed it into both Claude and Gemini, trying to get it to generate a blog article for me. And I found that because I was looking for a shorter form blog article, Claude did a much better job than Gemini did, because Gemini wanted to expand it into like a 20-page paper, and that's not at all what I wanted it to do, even though I told it to do a blog article. But other times when I've done other research, I found that Claude doesn't quite, its deep isn't that different from sort of the normal mode, versus, like I said, I really appreciate the way that the citations are done and even the integration into Workspace. Those two things are little things, but it's that kind of level of polish that when I need something deeper or longer, my go-to's been Gemini for that.
I really like the canvas feature that's built into Gemini. I don't know if you played around with that. You can use
I
it for
haven't played with
coding. You
that.
can
What is
use it.
that?
So I use it a lot for writing, because you essentially open Canvas within the normal Gemini interface, and it sort of pops up a panel on the right that feels just like a Google Doc. And so you've got your chat over here and you've got your doc over here, and you can put in your prompt, and then it edits the doc for you and with you. So it's like a collaborative editing experience within this doc, right in the same console, similar to what you can do with code generation, and it gives you a little sandbox and you can run your code. This does it with text, with the doc. And so you can have it create you an outline. It's like, okay, this outline looks great, let's work on the first section together, and it like builds out the first section. You can go in the doc and edit, you can make some tweaks back in the prompt, you can adjust it. Hey, I like what I'm saying, I don't like the tone of it, make it sound more like this or this, and it actually co-edits with you right in the doc. And then when you're done, you can actually save it right to your Google Drive, and it feels so nice and integrated. And I very much look forward to, I don't know, when we get to Gemini 3.0 or whatever they're going to call it, that sort of has the level of conversational intelligence that GPT-5 seems to have. I feel like that, as someone who writes a lot of things, would be a massive step up. It's already great, and to go from like great to stellar I don't feel like we're that far off.
So I have used that feature. I guess I didn't realize it was called Canvas, because at least in like the Workspace UI, when you're in a doc, there's just like the little Gemini icon and you click it and start using it. I didn't realize it had a
So
separate name.
yeah, that's a different thing. They've integrated, at least in G Suite sort of Workspace, they put the Gemini button everywhere. And so you can ask questions about a doc, and that's like the doc is the experience, and the chat is an add-on. This is the other way. So this is within the Gemini console, not within Google Docs. And
I
it's sort
see.
of it opens up this canvas within your chat context. And it really takes advantage of the million token context window. It's fantastic.
Now I want to talk about the million context window here in a second, but let's talk about this timeline that Google's been on, because there's been a series of announcements from them, or a series of events, I guess is the way to put it. If you go back to July 11th, that was the date that OpenAI's acquisition of Windsurf started to fall apart. And that I think most people anticipated was going to be a pretty big deal for them to buy the Windsurf IDE and to give them a path toward developers to go compete with Claude Code. But that completely fell apart when Google basically bought out the entire Windsurf leadership. Most reports were at about, for however many people it was, for like 2.4 billion, which, for Google is chump change. So that was July 11th. And then we got to the 23rd, and Google had, in the wake of their quarterly earnings call, right, they announced that, not only did they have 28 billion in profit on the quarter, but they announced that they were going to up the CapEx spend to 85 billion, where previously they had announced less than that. And then last week on August 14th, Oracle announces that the Google models are going to be available on OCI, which that's the first time I can think of, and maybe you can think of one that I'm not, where a Google service of some kind was available on another cloud.
Yes, I'm processing. Yeah, I can't really think of another example of where that's true.
And for Oracle, that makes sense given the announcement we talked about earlier that that Oracle's trying to be all things to everybody, I think, here, because they just announced the GPT-5 in the SaaS. If you're going to be able to access the Gemini models, because Oracle hasn't shown that they're developing any of their own, so being a place to serve up inferencing on those, I can't imagine that AWS is going to follow suit. But if you're going to have as many choices for model hosting, for model inferencing, if OCI is going to be sort of that fourth place you can potentially go, that's an interesting play for them.
It is. It's also interesting because didn't Oracle win an absolutely massive deal for OpenAI's infrastructure recently? I don't know, $30 billion
They did. It
uh
was, yeah.
data center deal. And so I don't know if I'm OpenAI and I'm paying Uncle Larry $30 billion, it would be disappointing to me to see them also, supporting everyone else's stuff. But I guess that's the business we're all in, right? You gotta meet the customers where they are, and sometimes your customers are also your partners, which are also your competition, right?
Well, clearly there was not an exclusivity clause as part of that hosting agreement, right? And yeah, I mean, the way that went down, if I remember correctly, Oracle first announced that they had a client, but they didn't say who it was. And then later on, they said who it was. But then, at least I want to say OpenAI's current funding that they've through VCs and other sources have accumulated on the order of 60 billion. And if half of that, or if half of the future, for them to have committed 30 billion to Oracle, the math of that isn't clear to me how that works out. And that's why, if Google's saying I'm going to spend 85 billion on infrastructure, but I just got 28 billion in profit from the quarter, that's a very different conversation than the one that OpenAI is having. And at some point, I wonder if that's going to catch up with OpenAI. But that's kind of a wait and see kind of thing.
Yeah, it's what wasn't clear from the $30 billion Oracle OpenAI deal was, is this essentially trading infrastructure for a spot on the cap table, or is there actual money changing hands?
Right. So let's now segue to the topic that you brought up a moment ago, which is the million token, the million token size windows, the context windows. So on August 12th, Claude announced that for Sonnet 4, it was now going to support a million tokens worth of context window. But there's a catch. And it's the same catch that when Google announced the million or 2 million token context window back in like the February, March timeframe, where there's a price cutoff in both. For Claude Sonnet, let me pull this up real quick. For Claude Sonnet, the first 200,000 tokens on that input context window, the first 200K are $3, but then it jumps to 6 above 200K. That's very similar to what Google did with Gemini Pro, but their pricing is lower, right? Their input, it's $1.25 for prompts under the 200K context window, but then it jumps to 250. So in both cases, it doubles, and you get similar prices on the output tokens as well. But it sets up this scenario where you can go higher, but you got to have a really good financial reason for doing so, because it's going to start to cost you.
Isn't it though, the 2.5, not Pro, is like 30 cents for a million? Like I was looking at it, and the someone did a comparison. I think I sent this to you,
You
of
did.
the accuracy versus the price. And so, like, yes, Claude is a few percent more accurate than regular Gemini 2.5, but it's 20x the cost. It's 30 cents versus $6 on Claude. And it's like, well, you have to be doing some really, really, really important things for that few percent of accuracy to be worth 20x. And I'm curious what kind of adoption they're seeing with that. It's just such a massive price delta.
Well, so the details matter here. So when you posted that to me, I did a little bit of research. And so what most of the vendors have, they kind of have two models, right? The more expensive one and the cheaper one. And in the Gemini world, it's Pro versus Flash. So Pro is the more expensive one, Flash is the cheaper one. For Anthropic, it's Sonnet is the cheaper one, and Opus is the more expensive one. So the way that this broke down was, for Flash, you're right. So for the least expensive Gemini model, it's 30 cents input, 30 cents for the input tokens, and it can be text, image, video, or whatever. And it's $1 if you go for audio, and it's $2.50 for $2.50 for the output. So if you do go, like, if you compare lower price model to lower price model, it is that 20x that you just cited. Gemini for Flash right now, they aren't making that breakout of like 200K tokens versus a million. So there's a little bit of, it depends on which model you're talking about, and it depends upon if you're talking the higher grade model or the lower grade model. So we don't have like pricing consistency here among any of them. But I thought it was interesting that Anthropic started to follow Google's model, where there's a cutoff where we're going to price you one way below 200K tokens, but above, we'll give you more tokens, but it's going to cost you. And some of these things that we were just talking about, Google can afford to price this lower because they don't have to make money on LLM inferencing in the same way that ultimately OpenAI or Claude or Cohere or any of those that are getting VC funding do. But it's, again, we reference what cloud was like, 13 years ago or so. And we were starting to see, things like database as a service and some of these PaaS platforms coming out. And it wasn't clear what was the pricing model going to be. And this is what we're starting to see in this LLM world. It's not just about per token pricing, but now there's a cutoff. There's like a knee in the curve.
Yeah, for me, it still comes back to, if it's only a bit better, but the delta is 20x, like what are the edge cases where that is necessary? Like the difference between Flash and Opus, in at least in this analysis that I was looking at, maybe we can
Nobody
link
knows
it
the
in
answer to
the
that
show
right now,
notes.
right?
I lost you.
Yeah, I lost you for a sec too. Say that again.
All right, I'll start.
Difference.
I'll start over. We'll cut out that bit. The difference between Flash and Opus being 20x. What are the edge cases where that matters? Because at least in the analysis that I had sent you, and maybe we can link it in the show notes, like it really only was, I think, a very small delta of better in Opus for 20x the cost. And yeah, I'm very curious, what are the very specific edge cases where that 20x is worth it? Because, man, the 30 cents versus $6 adds up real fast if you're doing any kind of material workload. You're making a few prompts and you're done, like, okay, cool, it's $10. But you're trying to run a business on that, that could get really expensive really fast. I don't know. I have a lot of questions.
Well, and nobody knows the answer to that yet, right? I don't think anybody has enough maturity in their use cases to know, is it worth 20x to get marginally better quality at this point? Or is this, the the bigger companies that have alternate sources of revenue, can they just ultimately price out everybody else, take it as a loss leader or at a much lower margin, and just wait everybody out?
I hope not. Like I think there's so much innovation still to happen and still to come, and the more people we have in this fight, I think the faster the innovation will happen, right? Like if it was only Google in this, like would they be pouring as much money into research to try and continuously one up? Or would they, sort of go as slow or fast as their customers drag them along? But the fact that like every month, every 2 months, there's a new model from somebody else and it's better than the other one, like this is fun times. And I like the fact that there's a whole bunch of players and even more showing up. So I don't know. I hope the money doesn't dry up before we get to a sufficiently advanced level of intelligence.
It's almost like competition breeds innovation.
That's one way to put it. Yes, but I think it's for a lot of these companies, it's not just about competition, it's about survival. And that level of um, that level of fear of relevancy in the near future is is a real driver, right? It's one thing to say, I don't have all the market share that I wish I had. It's another thing to say, like, we became completely irrelevant over the course of 24 months because we couldn't keep up on the innovation.
Right. But I think, as we've seen with some other technology revolutions, there's lots of corners to be successful here. There's not going to be one right answer, no matter how much the bigger capex players would like that to be. I mean, Anthropic has found a way at a much smaller, much smaller valuation and a much smaller amount of VC money that they've collected to compete in this market in a way that, they're not going to spend, 85 billion on capex anytime soon. I don't think that's part of their strategy. And as you pointed out last week, they've seemed to have found a niche where they can be competitive at a higher GP with a lower cost of goods sold. And I want to see others find other niches like that.
The back to our conversation from last week, like the margin on this stuff is going to be really telling. And I don't know, maybe at $6 for a million tokens, maybe the margin is great. Maybe they're still losing money. At this point, they're probably still losing money, even at $6 for that kind of compute power. But it's only going to go down over time, right? And uh, there will be, especially for the more basic models, which we may see that like a year from now, even GPT 4.0, Gemini 2.5 are just considered like the most basic near free kind of models that people are like almost willing to pay for because the open source alternatives are just as good. And like I think that there's going to be a baseline that develops of like a model from everybody that is sufficiently great that costs next to nothing and or can run in some variation on small instances. And I think that we're not far off from that.
And then above that, you either have some niche tuning or a niche model for maybe it's financial services or coding or healthcare, whatever that might be. And you might have different winners in each one of those verticals. I think that's probably where we're headed. But Yeah, I find myself every time I see one of those CapEx announcements from Google or Amazon or Microsoft, I keep thinking, like, how are these other guys going to keep up with that spend? And maybe they don't have to.
Yeah. They'll want to, though. That's
They'll
what's
want
gonna keep
to.
this fun. That's what's gonna
Right.
keep this fun for a
That will
while.
definitely keep it fun. Well, let's stop now. Let's stop there for this week. And until next week, when we'll have a new batch of announcements to talk about.
Excellent. Thank you, Pete.
This has been the Old Guy AI podcast. Views expressed here do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the sponsors or the employers of any hosts or guests.